Okay, we are now underway. McKinnon, off to you, sir.
Great. Thank you, Sean. And thanks, everyone, for joining us today. Just by way of background, I mean, the origin of this sort of webinar started actually last year's ComNet conference, which was just an incredible sort of learning opportunity. But one of the things that was sort of noticed as I sort of gazed around the various sort of sessions was that there really was no representation of people from the academic world or people from practicing in the social sciences. And based on some of the work that I had done with other foundations and through my own sort of studies, thought that there was a real opportunity to sort of say, how can we take the best practices and some of the greatest learning that are coming out of academia and apply it to strengthen and move our work forward. So, I hope that, what we get out of today's session is the sort of understanding that social science can greatly inform and improve our work. At the same time, it's been relatively untapped. When we think about social science, it's something that, I think its greatest strength and what's used foundationally and formative at the early stages of our campaigns or our program development. What's also interesting is that so often it's counterintuitive, so it allows us to sort of challenge our basic assumptions and question some of our core beliefs. And going beyond sort of the what and the how to really understanding the why. What are the mechanisms of change that are at play? We also want to dispel a couple myths. The reality is that most researchers, aren't just hoping to publish papers and be lauded by a couple of their peers, but really want to see their impact or their work have real-world impact. And in fact, there are many different ways in which that can happen, and we're going to share some of them today, including partnering directly with them, which is something that is probably an incredible opportunity, especially amongst this crowd. I want to start first with a little mini sort of case study about my own experience. As Sean had said, I am a practitioner, at heart, working with foundations and nonprofits on a whole host of issues. At the same time, I also have, a master's degree in media studies and have been teaching at the School of Visual Arts and at the New School over the course of the last several years. So I basically have had, a toe in each of these waters, and I've really seen some real opportunities. And one came up with this question, I think, that probably would be of interest to many of us on the phone when we think about core issues of poverty or opportunity and mobility and inequality that dominate the conversations today. A question that we were having is that, on one hand, this idea of the American dream is so central to who we are. And if you work hard, you can make it anywhere. But the reality is we know that always doesn't sort of, hold true for everyone. So the first thing we did was we actually went out and did some of our own research. And, like perhaps many of the people on the phone, you start with the what. We do some basic polling around sort of what people think actually contributes to the American dream. And we went out and we talked to Americans about this question. And no surprise, when we asked what was essential, hard work was number one, and parents were number two, and character was three. But it was somewhat surprising at the very bottom with, around a quarter of Americans thinking that your social network and who you knew or luck were essential, which seemed like a vast and gross underrepresentation. And where this really came to fruit was when we asked sort of the sort of forced choice question of which child is more likely to achieve the American dream. Someone who comes from a strong family but lacks ambition, or someone who comes, who has a strong work ethic but comes from an abusive home. And 70% of Americans think that the child from the abusive home will be more successful, including a majority of people who considered themselves liberal. So that really drove us to the question of saying, the what is great and important to know, but we really need to sort of understand this question of why. So as is often our inclination, we sort of start with what is out there and what's popular and what we've seen. And often that comes in the form of books that have been published where perhaps journalists repackage existing research to put forth a thesis. Or if a academic is fortunate to sort of have their work published and maybe do a TED Talk, then maybe it sort of results in a book. And three of those examples are you see before you: How Children Succeed, and Outlier, and in Grit. And what's really interesting in looking at these is that it really didn't get at the why so much. And in fact, it sort of perpetuated that what. It sort of reinforced this belief that if we just work hard, or if it is a question of character, then that would be sufficient. So when we think about this idea of the work that we're trying to do, and you realize that this whole school and this whole education system needs fixed, but you can always point to this one kid who made it, it raises the questions that other people say, well, why don't they just have the same grit as that kid, or where's the character, when we know there's so much at hand? So the idea is that while it's logical for us to sort of go to what we see in front of us and what we maybe read a review of, that it's essentially swimming in the shallow end. It's giving us just a taste of some of the studies. And in fact, what often happens is this work of academics and these long studies get simplified into sort of sound bites that don't allow you to really understand sort of the mechanisms at play, or what was really being sort of studied and what was sort of being discovered. So on our journey to really understand sort of like, well, what is this question of how people move up and how they think about it, we wanted to sort of, move to the deep end of the pool, which meant going to the source. Now, obviously, we did a lot of policy research and talked to folks at Brookings to understand what the real factors were that contributed to mobility, but we also wanted to sort of explore the question of how people think about it. So we reached out to various, academics at different universities in different kinds of ways. Some we had worked with before, some we hadn't. Some we, saw something that was written in the New York Times and just cold called the professor, and they were glad to give their time. And in some cases, we were able to speak to someone who was working with them, but not the person themselves. But they were able to give us such a deep appreciation of this question. And I want to go through sort of 5 lessons that we learned by working and talking with these academics and understanding the research more deeply. So the first one was we talked to a professor at University of California at Irvine named Paul Piff. And many of you may have heard of his work and his monopoly study. And trying to understand this question of power and privilege, he basically took 2 people who, had consistent belief systems going in. So it wasn't someone who was progressive against someone who was liberal or what have you. And he had them play a very short game of Monopoly. And in the game, they basically start with flipping a coin. Whoever wins the coin flip will essentially get twice as much money, roll 2 die, and will even get the Mercedes to drive around the board. The person who lost that flip will get half as much money, roll 1 die, and have to drive the shoe. And what ended up happening over the course of the game is that the person who started from a point of privilege and power actually changed the way they behaved towards the other, and the other did the same in reverse. So the rich player, actually started speaking differently to the other person. So you see the quote here, "You're going to lose all your money soon," sort of these derogatory comments about how they were doing in the game. They ate more of the community pretzels that were in the middle. They even, and they recorded all of these kinds of things, they even, measured the sound of the piece going across the board, and the person who had won that flip was actually banging the board louder. And what was most remarkable was at the end of the game, they asked, they filled out a questionnaire, and they asked the person who won, which is always the rich person, why they had won. And they almost never mentioned the coin flip. They would talk instead about how it was when they got the Monopoly when they landed on Park Place, or their sort of skill at this sort of point in the game. And what Pip pointed out was this idea of fundamental attribution bias. It is a bias that is so important that it's called fundamental. And what it means is that we have, as people, this propensity to overwhelmingly emphasize the agency of an individual and underestimate sort of the role that the environment around us plays. So this sort of simple sociological construct is so critical in sort of thinking about sort of how we get to where we are in life, as well as a whole other host of issues. So try and understand sort of, well, where do we go with that? So it's one thing to sort of maybe forget sort of and think about a Monopoly game, but how do you think about your own life? So we returned on to some of the work of Daniel Kahneman, Nobel Prize winner, and again, with Piff, I called him, he picked up the phone, and we spoke. Professor Kahneman, is a Nobel Prize winner and did not have access to him, but did get access to people who had studied his work and followed up on his studies. And what he sort of revealed was this idea of the experienced self, or the living self versus the remembering self. So in any given month, we have sort of 600,000 discretely defined moments. And of course, we can't remember most of them. And those that we choose to remember, we sort of that now becomes sort of part of our memory, and that becomes part of our remembering self. So this idea that 2 people could experience the same kind of surgery with the same sort of level of pain, but remember it completely different based on the story that they told themselves or how that procedure ended. So this idea is that as we sort of think about sort of our own lives and the struggles that maybe we have gone through, we have a tendency to sort of de-emphasize those struggles and remember the outcome. And what's important about this is not just sort of this collection of sort of memories. I mean, it is this sort of idea that it actually has a physiological basis. Our memories are literally, if you think about sort of neurons and neuron connections, we are connecting the dots of our own life to tell specific stories about how we got to where we are. And what's crucial in that is that it's not just the stories we tell, but it impacts the decisions we make. So in thinking about the sort of bias we have towards our own actions and the way that we sort of tell our own stories in a way that may sort of forget many of the things that helped us in one way, the question sort of remained, well, what could we possibly do? So we turned and spoke with Suzanne Mettler, who is at Cornell and who had written this book called The SmurfsSubmerged State. And this sort of idea that, we've, all maybe remember during the affordable care sort of debate while people were saying, like, keep your hands off my Medicare. But at the same time, we're against health care reform. And it was this idea that, part of the story that we were telling ourselves left out some of the things that we were actually sort of referring to. So the notion that, we could be in a situation where we were being helped all along by different things, teachers, schools, mentors, et cetera, but in fact, we're forgetting them. So, in the situation as it relates to Susan Mettler and part of our platform, we actually, did a couple of small experiments where we were sort of telling stories about people who may be responsible for those programs. And the picture you see here is a funny picture of Claiborne Pell, who used to go jogging in business suits that he would cut off. So he was very frugal and wanted to make sure that he was able to sort of reuse his suits for athletic wear, I guess. But when we put this story out about who he was, and including some of his little sort of quirks, and thanking him, personally for what he had done to make college education affordable for many through the Pell Grant, the response in terms of the comments on Facebook were really fascinating. People who were sort of thanking him, thank you, Mr. Pell, maybe not realizing that he had long since passed, or talking about how they wouldn't be able to go to college if it weren't for him. So it sort of unveiled this opportunity that if we do get people to reflect on their own lives, that they can take these invisible things that maybe they forgot or weren't aware of and make them visible and make that part of their sort of remembering self. And what this was really sort of, coming down to was this idea of also beginning to sort of challenge one of the narrative. Now, obviously, we started out challenging this idea that it's not hard work alone that will allow you to succeed. But in doing so, we also were coming up against what was a debate that was also happening on this issue of inequality and focusing, for this conversation on economic inequality. And, the social sciences include behavioral economists, communications researchers, but we also wanted to reach out to other sort of areas, and in this case it was a philosopher. So Harry Frankfurt wrote this book called On Inequality. And, I had previously talked to Senthil Melanathan from Princeton, who wrote a book on scarcity, who was really trying to sort of begin this conversation of inequality, while it's true and it exists, may not be the best way to talk about the issue from an economics perspective. Because technically speaking, you could, take money from everyone and make everyone poor, and that would not solve the basic needs of people who were struggling with poverty. So his point was that the debate that we should be having is not about equality, but sufficiency. In other words, what do we all need for a good life? So that was also part of the development of this platform, which was understanding what are the various things that we know contribute to helping people move up, and to give people the opportunity to reflect on their own lives to see if they were present or not. And the underlying theory was that if they are present, or if they weren't, you potentially would have more compassion and more support for those programs that indeed had helped you if we do remind you of the role that they had played. And this all boiled down to the final sort of conclusion that we learned. There is, again, a sociological term called limiting beliefs, which is to say that there is the factual way in which the world works, but through our own experience we may have seen something that limits our beliefs to accept that. It can happen in a way where, as a very early child, you may sort of fail at something like a sport and say instantly, I'm no good at baseball, which actually therefore becomes self-fulfilling prophecy and a limiting belief where perhaps it was just that you didn't have, the right instruction or the right equipment, or you were younger than your peers. And what this project has really told us, and we've done things where it's been online, to read in full, weekly newsletters that give people an opportunity to reflect. It's been turned into curriculum, both for students in high school as well as for people in the workforce, and have really found that this may be a real sort of key to addressing this sort of issue of the divisiveness we have around these kinds of conversations about mobility and opportunity. It is hard work, but it's so much more, and we can only make the case when we get people to reflect on their own experience. In terms of linking to practice, as we've been going through, we've been sharing what we've been learning as we've gone with people who are practitioners in the field, nonprofits and foundations, as well as journalists who write about this. And several have come back and said, hey, this is really changing the way we think we need to sort of cover this topic, which has been wonderful. And through the creation of these small pieces of content, we've been basically conducting experiments where can we take a piece of learning from social science and develop content that reflects it, and then partner with a media company to put it in the world and see if it can sort of draw the response we want. So we're actually establishing sort of the Media Lab, whose home we hope will be at the New School for Public Engagement in New York, and have had partners, media partners, who also want to sort of understand, their ability to really sort of impact these kinds of conversations, sign on as partners who want to sort of help promote and develop content with us, which has been a really wonderful sort of outcome that we're looking forward to. So with that said, we have two people who are doing some phenomenal research that we want to get to in a second and share not only what they've learned, but also importantly sort of ways to engage with the academic community from their perspective. But also want to sort of give a moment to sort of pause and answer any questions that have come up based on what we've covered thus far.
All right, so we have a couple of questions here, Bob. The first one comes from Casey, and the question is, does the fact that we de-emphasize our own personal struggles mean that if you're raising money for an entrepreneurial approach to poverty, you shouldn't target self-made business people because they may have forgotten how hard it was for them? So does it mean you should eliminate those folks, or is there another way to perhaps approach them?
Yeah, so I would say absolutely not to eliminate those folks. I think that what we've learned is that there is tremendous opportunity to sort of get people to think about sort of this question of being self-made and have them reflect, but to do it in a way that maybe is counter to the way that we've been doing it before. I mean, when we talk about sort of inequality or privilege, it can put people on the defensive. Because, in fact, many people, even if you did sort of start with sort of like a silver spoon in your mouth, you still had to do some things. So you can't sort of ignore hard work. You can't ignore fundamental attribution bias. But by getting people to sort of reflect on, remember that mentor, or remember that break you got, or hey, how did you get to get to go to college? And in fact, there's a whole sort of methodology of interviewing and sort of and getting to that point that maybe Rachel can talk to later, that really sort of speaks about how do you get people to sort of just reflect on their own life in a way that is not so off-putting or threatening, that allows them to have their own sort of realization. There's an interesting quote I saw from another social scientist that said, we don't convince people of anything. We give them the opportunity so they can convince themselves. And that's sort of what we'd be trying to do here.
Okay, so we have another question from Laura. Tristan, if you don't mind, just pull it up right there. Laura is asking, I'd like to learn more about the Moving Up Media Lab. What's the best way to do that?
Yeah, so Laura, I mean, at the very end of the presentation, you'll see contact for us. And so the best way would be to email directly, and I'd be happy to sort of share more with you, and with a one-page description of it. We can also email as well.
Okay, we have a question from my friend Michael Romali up in New York. The research of big names in social science are easily accessible through big publishers. So we're talking about, I guess I'm jumping ahead for you, Michael, but like Jonathan Haidt or the Malcolm Gladwells who are collecting a lot of the research that lots of folks are doing. But how can communications professionals access research that's related to their specific topical interests that's maybe a little less well known? So, and I know we're going to talk about that a little bit, but Bob, if you could just sort of maybe talk about how you disrupted your own, perhaps, habits, reading that Gladwell article in the New York, or picking up, listening to Shankar Vedantam on NPR. How did you get beyond the easily accessible stuff and tap into some of the research that maybe isn't getting quite as much publicity in the mainstream media?
Yeah. I mean, so there are a couple of things. I mean, one, I'm fortunate to work with organizations, like the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation and Gates and Ford, who are tapping into this stuff. So some of it I was able to sort of get exposed through some of the work that we were doing there. But I also sort of I was reading things like the New York Times, which has some really interesting stuff that they're always sort of putting a piece of research out there, and then it's easy to Google and find the person and say, hey, I'd love to learn more. And I think that's part of their hope when that stuff gets that kind of wider distribution. There are popular things like Scientific Mind, that are published that I pick up and sort of get exposed to. It's sort of like, when you're reading something to sort of just not sort of gloss over this fact of like a study says and accept just how that's been positioned, but sort of dive deeper, go find the study, go call the person. So I think that was something that was sort of helpful for me. There is this sort of ability, and I mean this term in a good way, this really fun rabbit hole you can sort of go down sometimes in your, learning about a topic that allows you to want to learn more and more. We will share at the end of this some resources that you can go to and sign up for that are good sort of collectors of this kind of stuff. And the other thing, too, I would just sort of say is that, before Jonathan Haidt was Jonathan Haidt, he was just Jonathan Haidt, you know what I mean? So there is a sort of idea that, like, people are doing, this is by the time something gets published, it's often their life's work. And they have been sort of going at it for a very long time and doing some interesting research. So there's a real advantage, I think, sometimes to sort of talking with up-and-coming researchers because you can help shape, maybe some of the things they're pursuing.
We're going to take one more question, Bob, and then I know we have a lot to get through, and we'll have more time, of course, to take questions at the end. And, of course, you can send in questions through Twitter, and we can get to them after the fact as well. But Lori asks, would you suggest that we start our communications from the perspective of our target audience rather than starting from the problem we're working to solve? Pretty fundamental question.
Yeah, so I think that's a really great question. What I would say is that when you think about starting, I think from a communications perspective at least, I think it's really critical to start from understanding how people are already coming to an issue. So that's part of the equation. Like, how does the general population think about climate change? How are they thinking about poverty? And understanding the differences between different types of people. How are liberals thinking versus, conservatives? How are older people younger, et cetera. But the other aspect is, is what's the behavior change you're looking for? So obviously, what you're trying to do will dictate who you're speaking to. But beyond that is that there's a lot of great research that is specific to types of behavior. So Mary Beth later will talk about this question of stigmatization, which we know impacts a lot of issues. So there's a lot of wonderful research about sort of what contributes to and what can help alleviate stigmatization, and which groups are open to those kinds of sort of things. So I think that it's an understanding, it's sort of a holistic kind of question, which is what are we trying to do and who's going to help us get there? And let's really try to understand how people are reacting to both of those questions.
Fantastic advice. I think everyone who does communications for a living has to understand when you walk in the room, part of your big value add is asking the big questions. Who's our audience? How do they think? Where do we want to move them if they need to move? Where might they be stuck? And there's a lot of research out there with social science that's allowing us to understand that better and better, and in very, very precise ways, perhaps weren't even possible 10, 15 years ago. But we'll get to more questions in just a little bit. Why don't we go ahead and move on? Thank you so much to everybody for your questions. We'll get back to them a little bit later, and Bob, I'll hand it back to you.
Great. So I'm going to turn it over to Rachel right now, who, again, as an example, some of her work was referenced in an op-ed in the New York Times, and I reached out to her, and she was so wonderful in terms of taking the time and to talk and share some of her research, and is open to future collaboration. And I think as she talks about the specific research that drew me to her, you'll see exactly how that sort of fit in logically to the work that I was sort of discussing. So I'll turn it over to Rachel.
Hi all, thanks for having me today. I'm really excited to be here. As Bob said, my name is Rachel Rattan. I'm at the Kellogg School of Management at Northwestern University. My general research interests are in the areas of compassion, empathy, and prosocial behavior. In particular, I've been interested in lapses in interpersonal empathy and how they emerge. One thing that has long interested me about my chosen field of social psychology is the ability of experimental research to provide evidence that counters our most fundamental assumptions about human nature. And one line of work that I think captures this sentiment pretty well is work I've done with Lauren Nordgren of Northwestern, and Mae McDonnell of the University of Pennsylvania. This research began with a seemingly simple question. When faced with a difficult life of experience, such as a difficult divorce or job loss, who should you reach out to for empathy and support? Most people recommend reaching out to someone who has been through that same experience, drawing on the intuition that shared experience breeds empathy. That is, they've been in your shoes. But in our work, we found that this intuition is often incorrect. In both lab and field-based experiments, we had study participants evaluate someone who was struggling or failing to endure a difficult life event, from a fatiguing exam to unemployment or childhood bullying. What we found was that these struggling individuals were actually shown less compassion and more contempt by observers who had been there themselves, compared with observers who had no past experience with the event. Again, we studied a range of experiences. This even included a polar plunge charity event in Chicago. This was a really fun study to run. We suggested that this effect emerges because of something psychologists call hot to cold empathy gaps, which involves a constrained memory for past emotional experience. So the combined experience of I can't recall how difficult it was, and I know that I got through it myself, produces compassion toward others struggling with that event. So knowing that this effect exists and can occur, we've since turned our interest toward understanding how compassion can be reignited among those who have endured distressing experiences. For example, in a new line of research with Katie DeSales of the University of Toronto, we've been examining whether shifting people's understanding of how they successfully coped with difficult life experiences can buffer against reduced compassion. So this idea kind of draws on stuff that Bob has talked about, whereby when people think of their own success, they tend to emphasize their own effort and ability. But by shifting their attention to focus on the help and advice they may have received from others, we were able to successfully increase compassion and prosociality toward others struggling with a similar event. And just a quick example of one of these studies, we sent out an email to 2,000 MBA alumni. In this study, participants were randomly assigned to watch a really short video, which featured an alumnus of the program who spoke either about how his own individual hard work and effort led him to be successful in the program, graduate, and get a job, or he talked about his relational experience, how working together with others really facilitated his success in the program. What we found was that the participants who watched the student talk about how relationships and social support really helped him through were actually more likely to donate to the alumni support network, and they were more compassionate toward current students. And this was driven by their increased focus on the needs of others, especially the current students. So together, my co-authors and I think that this line of work has a lot of important real-world implications across a wide range of sectors. And consistent with this point, as Bob mentioned, this work did get some media attention. For example, it was covered in the Harvard Business Review, New York Times, and NPR. And while it got some interesting conversations started, one thing I've noticed so far is that it's been difficult to translate these conversations into practice. That is, to take these conversations to the next step, to collect data in the wild. And given how much interest my colleagues and I do have in partnering with foundations and organizations, I'd like to share a couple of my thoughts on how we might turn interest in scientific research into good collaborations going forward. One, again, as was mentioned, just simply reach out. A lot of us are really more than happy to talk about our work, especially junior people, advanced doctoral students, or assistant professors. We tend to, again, are very enthusiastic and probably have more of a bandwidth than these star academics like John Haidt. Second, begin with a frank discussion of questions of mutual interest. So for us, some really clearly applied questions that remain include, how do our findings affect mentorship relationships and programs? And how do you get people with emotional distance from an event or cause to give? The one step that I think is most commonly missing is discussing the three W's of research here, the who, when, and where of implementing the research questions. What samples are we both interested in? When could we run a study? What might this look like? And so on. So again, we'd all be really interested in collaborating, and I think this is an important discussion to have going forward. So thanks so much for tuning in. I'll turn it back over to you, Bob.
Great. Thank you, Rachel. And again, this is something that, if you were sort of coming into this with sort of one kind of assumptions, which I think maybe would be natural, that if we want to engage people on our cause, it's good to, reach out to people who have already experienced it. And yet, much of this research suggests that may not be the case, which I think is really fascinating. But to the question that was raised earlier, it doesn't mean that we avoid it. It means that we address it. So, some other research that Rachel and her collaborators are looking at, for example, looks at the idea that you can improve relationships inside a prison if you get corrections officers to basically reflect on the challenges of their own bringing. They actually are more compassionate to the people who they're then sort of serving and working with in prisons, which in today's environment and climate, you could see the huge practical implications of that. There are just so many sort of ways in which you can sort of say this is a study that maybe was looking at this one issue, but it can be sort of certainly applied to so many others. With that said, I want to turn it over to Mary Beth Oliver at Penn State, who's going to talk a little bit about, why do certain things work and how can we, harness the media messages for greater social good. Mary Beth?
Thank you so much. And let me just echo everyone and say thank you very much for the opportunity to be here. It's a real honor, and I am very hopeful that there's going to be many fruitful collaborations that result from this. So what I wanted to do here was just give you a brief background in the kind of research that scholars are doing in media effects, how that led me into a program of research that's looking at positive media effects, give you an example of a study and the kinds of questions that we might ask, and then end by talking about how I think that it would be mutually beneficial for us to forge greater partnerships with people in practice. So the area I'm in, the background is media effects. Sometimes people call it media psychology. And historically, this research, it employs social scientific methods. And historically, it's examined negative sorts of effects of media, like how media might increase violence, or it might be decreasing our attention spans, or it might be increasing obesity. And when it comes to entertainment scholarship, a lot of that work had been assuming, and maybe rightly so, that entertainment is largely a hedonistic sort of activity, that we're pleasure seekers and that we're just using media entertainment to sort of turn off. But as I was doing my research, my data kept suggesting to me over and over again that while, sure, some media entertainment or a lot of media entertainment is there for our pleasure, if you think about your own media consumption and your own types of media examples that you found most profound, most valuable, then what you'll probably see is you might be thinking of films like To Kill a Mockingbird or Hotel Rwanda or Schindler's List even. And these aren't films that we might say we enjoyed. In fact, it would be odd, but that were enriching to us. So this data kept showing up again and again in our work, and we finally took note of it and really started to look at how these valuable forms of media entertainment and non-fiction entertainment content too can be harnessed. And so over the course of several years, we've looked at media entertainment that we find particularly touching or moving or emotional. And we've applied it to examine the effectiveness of a host of outcomes, such as health campaigns on melanoma, or the reduction of stereotyping of race, or enhanced feelings of well-being. So just to give you an example of the kind of study that we might do, in this particular study, we were interested in looking at campaigns that were designed to reduce stigmatization of people with mental health issues. Now, when you look at media effects research, it's not just that we're interested in only the outcomes, as that title might imply, but we're also very interested in what it is about the message that's working. What is it about the user response that is effective? And what are the mechanisms involved? And so in this particular study, we were caught up in the idea that emotion is a large and important component of the process of the effectiveness of many campaigns. And so we wanted to arouse emotion while keeping the message itself constant. And so we did that by using different kinds of music. And in the condition, the experimental condition, we were attempting to arouse moving, touching, feeling tender affect by the music that we used. And then we were also looking at whether or not those emotional responses would be associated with greater connectedness or greater feelings of pity and what that might imply. So this is just real brief. You might, if you're having trouble seeing this, I apologize, so I'll just try to describe it. What this study found was that this music, this one little element of this campaign, was effective at inducing the kind of emotion that we were hoping for, and that led to feeling greater connection with the people depicted in the campaign, also with greater pity, but it was that greater connectedness that led to more favorable attitudes toward the group portrayed, greater behavioral intentions to help the group portrayed, and even behaviorally seeking more information. So a couple of things here that I'll just mention that I think are take-home messages is that you need to look at those mechanisms, because here pity was detrimental to the goals, whereas connectedness was effective. You also need to look at behavioral outcomes if you can. And one thing that I'm hoping that we can do, that we're moving toward, is trying to move beyond just self-report measures of emotion. Here we use just self-report, but we have many additional measures that we could be moving toward, like physiological measures or facial expressions, and additional behavioral indicators too, like sharing of social messages. So let me just end here by talking about a couple of ways that we're trying to broaden our program of research, both at Penn State and at many universities in the country and internationally. One thing I'm doing is partnering with two colleagues, Art Rainey at Florida State University and Sophie Yannicka at Chapman, and we were very grateful to receive a sizable grant from the John Templeton Foundation to spend the next 3 years looking at inspiring social messages and how that works to both increase feelings of altruism, increase social sharing, increase feelings of well-being. We also partnered with a colleague, Leonard Reinicke, and we just this book is just out on the Handbook of Media Use and Well-Being, where we've synthesized. Well, the subhead is International Perspectives on Theory and Research on Positive Media Effects, and so we have there are just a tremendous number of scholars who are interested in this issue. It's a hot issue right now. I just got back from a conference in Japan in June, and we invited scholars to a session who were interested in using media for social good and studying this. And the room, it was standing room only. People were spilling out into the hall. So there's just this large untapped resource. I just want to end here by reiterating that there are a large number of scholars who are interested in this issue. And it's not just that we're interested in theory. There's a great deal of enthusiasm for making our scholarship have practical value. We don't want it to just end in the journals. And just to give you a case in point, we're getting ready to do some work on who is exposing themselves to inspiring media messages, who selects to view these kinds of things online, who shares these kinds of things. And so, of course, we're using theory to inform our design, but we ended up contacting Upworthy and asking them, you tell us, what are the kind of questions that you have that you're struggling with? What are the kind of issues that we need to be cognizant of as we go about doing our work, because we want our work to matter in a very practical sense. And then the last thing that I'll just end with is that I really do think that this collaboration between academics and practitioners is mutually beneficial. Of course, we want, as researchers, to see if we can examine the effectiveness of messages in ways that are theoretically relevant and that are important. But we also think that our use of theory might help practitioners in the field as they go about designing messages. So unless you have theory that you can replicate, then it's difficult to know, is this tweaking of this message attribute important? What should we do? What kind of emotional response or cognitive reaction should we really be targeting? And so we think that the practitioners can really help us focus our questions, and we hope that our theory can help practitioners as well in their goals. So with that said, thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mary Beth. And again, I think what's so great about Mary Beth's research is that she's trying to uncover on the front end so many of the questions that we sometimes ask on the back end. The ice bucket challenge happens, and we then question sort of why was that so successful, and people want to replicate it without understanding the sort of the mechanisms of what was at play there. And that's the kind of sort of scholarly work that can so greatly inform our efforts moving forward. So in terms of where do we go from here and what are the takeaways, I want to start first with a question came up earlier, and this is just the tip of the iceberg. But there are a whole host of resources that allow us to sort of see some of this research and connect to it before it sort of bubbles up to a book or a TED Talk or the New York Times. The first three are basically websites that are aggregating sort of really interesting research that's being done. The Greater Good Science Center is out of Berkeley. The Science of Philanthropy Initiative is out of the University of Chicago. I believe they both have email newsletters to sign up for, and also are really just interesting contacts. If you're interested in a specific thing or topic or behavior change, they're an excellent resource for seeing what maybe is already out there. There are a couple of conferences that happen every year, one by the International Communication Association and one by the National Communication Association, where this work is presented and is valuable. And here are just 5 of probably 25 journals that, I would imagine, I'm not subscribed to any of them. I don't see them. I don't know if many of you are, but in each one of them, they are chock full with research that is basically right at the heart of what we're sort of doing. The Journal of Social Issues, the Journal of Communication, the Journal of Media Psychology, all fascinating stuff, and research that has obviously been vetted and peer-reviewed, so we know that the findings are legitimate. In terms of what can you do now, there was a question that came up saying, that I think referenced the amount of time that they have, and completely appreciate that there are so many demands on it. So here's a couple of things maybe to start with. One is this idea of start by asking sort of what does the research say. When we sit down either to develop a program or invest in one or to communicate about it, starting with those questions I talked about before, sort of, well, what do people think about this issue? What do we know about this specific behavior change we're trying to create? So we can explore, both the issue, what's been written on climate change, and what's the behavior change. So there's been a tremendous amount of research on donation or signing petitions or showing up or calling your congressman, all those kinds of behaviors that might be valuable and interesting to us in terms of actions that we want to see. There is a huge opportunity, as we've heard, both by Mary Beth and Rachel, to engage researchers directly. Sometimes you will get lucky and have access to a celebrity researcher. But it's just as valuable to find the people who are sort of doing the work every day on issues that they're still in the nascent form of exploring, and to influence and partner with them. What's been really interesting to me is that sort of much like any other field, there is an extensive and well-connected network. So when you talk to one researcher, they may not be doing exactly what you want, but if you said, who else is doing interesting work in this area, they will probably have a list of 3 or 4 or 5 others. And that's what's also really sort of valuable and helpful in that process. I think that some of us are on, some of those on the phone right now are also in a very unique position as a funder. And I should have said this up front. Some of what we were able to learn from moving up was the result of a grant that we had gotten from the Ford Foundation and some other support that we had gotten from a nonprofit, Photo Wings, who was interested in the question of what photography does to motivate people to think about where they are in life. So in those situations, there's the opportunity not only to learn what's out there, but to create what should be out there, to say this is a question that we as a field need to understand and we need to explore. And I want to learn that, and I'm going to have the opportunity to shape that learning that's going to be most relevant for our needs, but also can greatly inform the field. And I guess there is no sort of simple answer to I don't have much time and, where do I start? I think that some of this stuff is so foundational to human behavior and how we exist and how we relate to causes that it becomes imperative for us to carve out the time. And it could just be 30 minutes, a week where we're sort of, diving in or having a meeting around a specific study. But I think that hopefully what we've communicated today, there's so much that we are learning every day about how people think and how they interact with their world that has profound implications for our work. So, hopefully you'll leave this sort of session thinking that it is well worth your time. I know we're going to open up to questions. You see our contact information also listed there for any further sort of questions or inquiries, and look forward to fielding any more questions you have.
Thank you all very, very much. We have a number of questions. We'll try to get to a few of them in the limited time that we have left this hour. Beth has an observation and a question. She's a social scientist working in a nonprofit research setting, and one of the challenges that she faces is explaining the role of research to drive decision-making, messaging, and things of that nature. I think the question she's asking, I think this is for you, Bob, is have you faced this challenge? And can you talk a little bit about how you've approached it? How do you actually use research to drive decision-making, to intercede early on, perhaps, in whatever the project is that perhaps you're trying to move forward?
Yeah, so we have, and sometimes those are really difficult and challenging conversations. A lot, for example, of research has been done on message complexity and the need to sort of simplify, or framing of certain issues to sort of reach a broader audience. And have been met with, we had done a project in the state of Connecticut, for example, where research told us, that appealing to someone's enlightened self-interest, which again is a sociological concept, is an effective way of engaging them in an issue. So, trying to find their reason for engaging you, not making them engage for your reasons. And, there was one person from a large foundation who literally said, this makes my skin crawl to think that we have to appeal to someone's self-interest. And it resulted in a really sort of interesting sort of discussion and debate. Similarly, we developed a tool that was featured at ComNet last year, Violi, which allows people to sort of check their text using natural language processing to sort of see how it resonates with people. And people have told us that is a tool that is really helpful in terms of having challenging conversations between, say, program people and staff or communication staff, saying this is the more effective way, this is what the research tells us. So it's interesting that so much of the work that we do in general is research-based, but when it comes to communications, we don't always sort of go to it. So I see that the ability to sort of take this is what the research says and use it as an effective tool for advocating for the better way to engage someone is the best way to sort of go. This is not an opinion anymore. This is what the science says.
Yeah, let me just, if I can, reiterate that point. I think one obstacle that so many of us who lead communications teams or work on communications teams for the organizations that we serve, these foundations and nonprofits, is that for many of our colleagues, whether it's in leadership or on the program side, don't necessarily realize that there is increasingly a lot of science and rigor behind the work that we do. And it's incumbent upon us as leaders within our organizations to really bring people to understand that there is, in fact, a lot of research, and if you want there to be, and in fact, if you're practicing communications in a smart, strategic, responsible way, you need to think deeply about using research and data to inform your decision-making, to inform your messaging, to understand your audiences, so that you can be efficient and precise and disciplined. Otherwise, oftentimes, we're shooting in the dark, and that may be the way we worked, many of us, a decade or two ago, but that's not a best practice anymore. Simply isn't, and it's incumbent upon each of us to really champion that within the organizations that we work. All right, I'm going to get off my soapbox. I'm going to take a question from Tara, and this is for Rachel and Mary Beth, and that is, what's an example of a particularly valuable research partnership you've developed with an organization? I'm going to presume it's like a nonprofit organization or foundation, and how is that structured? So Rachel or Mary Beth, if you can offer a specific example of partnering with a foundation or nonprofit that really helped you move your research forward and also benefited them.
Well, I'll be happy to jump in. One that comes to mind immediately was via Bob and the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, and they were interested in what aspects of news stories about stigmatized groups. And in this case, the groups of interest were immigrants, people who were incarcerated, and even senior citizens. So how is it that we can devise news stories? How could we present news stories about these groups in a way that helps reduce stigmatization of these groups and be more compassionate about the kinds of struggles that they face? So for us, we found that very theoretically important. It highlighted and it really touched on the importance of emotion and harnessing that. And so that was extraordinarily useful. I will say, though, in many other instances, we are actually studying campaigns, real examples of media out there that people have produced and put online, where there is no partnership, but we're interested in what was it about that message that was effective. And an example in point was, I mentioned earlier, this study about melanoma. There was a PSA that came out of Canada on melanoma that went viral. It was called Dear 16-Year-Old Me. It was a very, very successful campaign. And we were interested in what was it about that message that made it so effective. Now, did we work with the producers? No. And that's a missed opportunity. That's just an example of our eagerness to work with people. So, if we could have more of those kinds of opportunities up front, I think that would be very fruitful.
I agree. I mean, we're really interested in interesting data that we can get our hands on. So, in that sense, really happy to help on the front end of campaigns so long as we get to see ourselves what happens. I'll also say I've found really fruitful relationships where you can find a scenario where yourself as a researcher gets to ask questions but are also happy to ask questions for the foundation. So for example, my colleague and I are currently working with the organizers of a conference for small foundations, and what we're doing is we'll go into the conference and get to ask participants questions of theoretical interest to ourselves, but are also helping the foundation by using the scientific method to ask participants questions that are of interest to them. So I think it's just a matter of having these frank discussions up front and seeing what both sides really want to get out of the partnership.
I'm going to offer an observation here from a very probably well-known to many of you, recent social issue that's moved significantly over the last 5 or 6 years, and that's the question of marriage for gay and lesbian couples in this country. Obviously now that's the law of the land. It wasn't not too long ago. And in fact, what shifted the debate in a really profound way was research. As I suspect many of you know, particularly if you've been following our series in the Stanford Social Innovation Review, you know that there were a number of researchers who were engaged by folks like the Gill Foundation and Haas Fund, who in the wake of the California Prop 8 decision, which many people had expected would make California the first state to make marriage legal, it was defeated narrowly. Many advocates came back, a few actually very brave advocates came back and said, perhaps we're doing this wrong. And rather than simply trying to do more of what they were doing, but better and stronger and more vigorously, what they did was they said, we need to conduct a research project. We need to understand where we're stuck. Or more importantly, we need to understand where people who don't agree with us are stuck. And so with the help of Gill and Haas and a number of others, they conducted research in, I think, 4 or 5 different states, really trying to focus on, in this case, it was moderate middle-class voters who were swing voters and who were going to be potentially persuadable, but for whatever reason at the moment were opposed to the idea of gay and lesbian couples getting married. And what they discovered over the course of that research, which took a number of years, was that love and commitment was a much more compelling argument. A data-based argument could be made that if you talk to people, individuals who were opposed or ambivalent about the idea of marriage for gay and lesbian couples, if you talk to them about it and explain to them that that gay and lesbian couples wanted to get married because they were in love and wanted to celebrate commitment in front of their community, well, suddenly you saw a real profound shift in the way that people were thinking about things. And that was all database. It was a really extraordinary thing. And of course, now we know, we've heard President Barack Obama, we've heard others use this love and commitment frame, and we've seen a lot of nonprofit organizations, advocacy organizations using this frame, where before, for many of you, if you followed this closely, you may recall almost all the conversations around marriage equality for a number of years until fairly recently were about equality. In fact, there was a famous campaign as part of that Prop 8 effort that was about the 1,132 rights and benefits that are conferred to you to get married when you get married as a straight couple, and that those rights and benefits should be conferred to everyone equally under the law. Not surprisingly, that wasn't super compelling to a lot of folks who weren't already supportive of marriage. So research can have a really, really profound impact, and it recently has in our country's history. So I do hope that folks are thinking about that in a really deep way. All right, again, I'm sorry to take over here. Elizabeth has a great question, which is, scholarly research takes a really long time to produce. So how do we ensure that we're tapping into research that's timely and current? How are we making sure we're not getting yesterday's news or stuff that's a decade old and perhaps isn't valid anymore? Any thoughts on that, any of the three of you?
Yes. Just quickly, I think it's publishing that takes the longest time. So that's another advantage of actually connecting with scholars themselves. A study, an experiment, for instance, might be done in a month or so. It's just the procedure of getting the work out there and in the public that takes a while. So that's why it's really helpful to get on the ground and really talk to people when you can.
As an example of that, I mentioned earlier this criminal justice research that Rachel and her colleague were doing, sort of like looking at correction officers and their relationships to people in prison. And that's not published. It may not be published for a while, but that's not precluding a conversation that we're sort of setting up between us and a leading organizational in criminal justice to sort of talk about that research. So that's why you don't have to wait to publishing. It's having the conversation before and even helping sort of design an experiment early on if it fits in the research interests of the people you're talking to.
We have run out of time. Thanks all to everyone who's joined us, but most particularly to Bob, to Mary Beth, and to Rachel for a really, really fantastic session. I know I've learned a ton over the course of the last hour. If you would, I know a number of you already jumped off, but before the rest of you leave, please take the survey. It's going to pop up on your computer just as soon as I say goodbye. It takes you less than a minute, and it'll really help all of us to hear your feedback. It's the research that we do to make sure that these webinars are helpful and on point for all of you. A couple final notes. For those of you who are headed to Detroit for ComNet 16, fantastic. Looking forward to seeing you in about 62 days, if I'm doing my math properly. Those of you who are thinking about registering, I'm going to be the bearer of bad news. Unfortunately, we are now sold out. We will be and have set up a wait list. Typically, we take about 15, 20, maybe even a few more folks over the course of the next month or two. So please put your name on the wait list if you didn't get a chance to get in. We will do our best to try to get as many of you in as we can. And then a final little note, our series with Stanford Social Innovation Review that I just mentioned, it's called The Case for Communications. You can check that out at ssirreview.org. There's about 11 or 12 case studies, including that one I spoke about from the Gill Foundation, talking about their research to support or their funding to support research on marriage equality. That series is going to conclude next week with a case study from the Clinton Foundation. Yes, that Clinton Foundation. You can follow along again at ssir.org. If you have any questions, of course, feel free to be in touch. As I mentioned at the outset, we will be posting this up online in the next week or two, so feel free to share it with your friends and colleagues, and do appreciate you being with us. We'll be back in touch shortly with our next webinar. Thanks again to everybody for being with us. Cheers.